We're going to move on to Act 3. This is where we shift to Israel specifically. So Genesis up to 11, Genesis 1 through 11, is really all of the various nations. We have the story of the flood. We have the Tower of Babel. We have all of those sorts of things. In Genesis 12, we get the character Abraham. And from there, we move forward with Israel. So what we're going to do here is, I've got these four images. We've got this image. This is obviously what? Noah's Ark, right. Any guesses as to who this is supposed to be?
It's one of the brothers that ran off, got married twice, and then came back with all his kids. Or am I wrong?
Actually, these two would be, this is Abraham. Yeah, and so, maybe in that, family, right? This is, with the big tablets,
Yeah.
would be Moses, there you go. And then this is King David. A little bit harder to guess that one because there's not a lot of dead giveaways there. Yeah, so Noah, Abraham, Moses, and then David. These are going to be kind of our main characters for the next part of our lecture. So the story thus far in Scripture, God is the creator of a good world and has placed humans in it to rule and reign on his behalf, reflecting his goodness and glory. Instead, humans rebel against this, and as a result, they experience the consequences of broken relationships and a broken ecosystem. Lost access to the sacred space of the garden. Death enters the scene and infects every generation. Humans fail in their attempts to control God for their own benefit, which is Genesis 11. And by the way that we interpret the Tower of Babel, likely what's happening there, it's not the way that we normally read that, the way that most people normally read that, is that you have this just big tower thing, and people are trying to reach God, right? They're trying to get into heaven. Really what's probably happening there is there are these things in the ancient world called ziggurats. And ziggurats have these giant staircases.
Like the Mayans used and all that.
Yeah, similar to the Mayans, yeah. These were considered stairways for the gods, and the idea of a ziggurat is you build one and it sort of motivates the god to come down. So really what the people who are building the Tower of Babel, what they're trying to do is they're trying to manipulate God into being controlled by them. Actually, I can show you this is a neat thing. Let me pull this up real quick. It's amazing what we can do with technology, just so cool. So you can go to Google Maps, and anybody know what town Abraham is from in the Bible? Some good Bible trivia for you. Yeah. So if you do U-R, and then of the Chaldees or Chaldees in Iraq, you can actually get the Great Ziggurat of and there's the Great Ziggurat of There's a picture of it. But you can actually see in Google Maps, right here is the Great Ziggurat of We can zoom in on it, and you can actually kind of see.
Wow.
That is the Great Ziggurat of and you can see the big staircase here, and then the flat top here, right? And that is. I'm not saying that the Ziggurat of is the Tower of Babel, but the Tower of Babel would have been similar to the Ziggurat of And this is what it looks like, if you're a person on the outside, right? You got some people here walking up it.
Rooms on the inside, or is it just
Nope.
a wall?
Solid all the way through.
Wow.
Yeah, solid all the way through. Because there's nothing, the objective isn't to store anything inside of it. The objective is to give the deity a place to come down, right? And so it's really just a giant structure to support stairs, right? That's the idea, is that you're supporting these gigantic stairs for the deity to come down. And so that's what we mean here about humans failing in their attempt to control God, is that they're trying to motivate God to come down. They're trying to be in control of God coming down rather than submitting to what God wants them to do. And we have this sort of juxtaposed. Do you guys remember what juxtaposed means? It's when you put two things together to contrast them with one another. Right? You have two things that are very different. You put them beside each other. So we have this juxtaposed against Genesis 12, where Abraham shows up. Because in Genesis 11, they build the Tower of Babel because they're trying to make a name for themselves. In Genesis 12, God promises that he'll make Abraham's name great. Right? So you have this juxtaposition, this contrast, where the people fail in trying to make their name great, and then God chooses Abraham and says that he will make Abraham's name great. Right? So the people aren't able to do that themselves. God is going to do that for Abraham because he wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. God lays the foundation of redemption and a promise to Eve. We talked about this briefly already. The proto-evangelion in Genesis 3:15, that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. God begins to redeem humanity through intentional relationship, specifically with this concept of covenant. And so we'll talk about covenant here in just a second in more detail, but the four images that I gave you, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, are kind of the four primary covenants of the Old Testament. These are the four primary characters who have a covenant with God. And so Noah makes covenant, God makes covenant with him to not destroy the earth again. This is where we get the rainbow, right? Abraham, God makes covenant that he will give his people land, heritage, and blessing. Through Moses, God makes a covenant to be uniquely committed to a specific people, the Israelites. And then through David, God makes a covenant that he will provide a ruler who will restore and reign over the throne of David forever. So, I'm going to go ahead and watch another video here because the Bible Project is amazing. They do a really great job with covenants.
You've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much, and that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
You've been around Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who is able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
Yeah, so the idea of a covenant is you have this promise that's made between 2 parties, like they said, right? It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. It's all right. And so these people that covenant isn't just a thing from God to humans. Like, there are people in the ancient world that have covenant with one another, right? It's like a treaty, right? I promise to do something, you promise to do something, and as long as I'm doing what I'm supposed to do and you're doing what you're supposed to do, then we get along with one another, right? That's basically what covenant is, right? A lot of times they're made between unequal parties, between king and his subjects, for instance. Sometimes equal parties between 2 nations or something like that. There's usually specific identity given, like, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Remember we said yesterday, this is something that precedes expectations, right? So God delivers them from Egypt and then gives the law, right? So God acts in the covenant prior to their opportunity to do anything. So again, God is acting out of grace. Everything that God does is out of grace. This is not something that they're earning. Even in the law, they're not earning it. The law is not a matter of legalism, it's grace. Even in the law, like you have things like, there shall be no poor among you, but when there are, right? Well, that means that God has built into the law exceptions. That like, hey, here's what my standard is, but when you don't meet that standard, here's what you should do, right? And then you've got all sorts of sacrifices where it's like, here's what you should sacrifice. But when you don't have that, sacrifice this. And if you don't have that, sacrifice this, right? So when we read the Old Testament, we actually should, especially the law, we shouldn't see it as legalistic. There's lots of exceptions. There's lots of grace built into it that we wouldn't normally notice. So promises are made, sometimes only on one side, like with the covenant with Noah, but often on both sides. There's blessings for obedience, there's curses for disobedience, and there's usually some kind of sign or a symbol that sort of indicates that the covenant has been made, right? So circumcision or rainbow are pretty noticeable examples of that. In Noah's covenant, Genesis 9, there is rampant death and destruction following the fall. Noah is introduced as a righteous man, probably the only one. Following the flood, Noah is given a covenant promise that God will never again do this. And God gives the rainbow as a sign that he is no longer going to do this. Right? This isn't something he's going to do anymore. Especially the language that's used, the rainbow is sort of like, it's like a archery bow, right? Like that's what the rainbow, that's why it's named bow. That God is like laying down his weapons, is the idea. Yeah.
So what was the purpose for him to do that, but to not do it again if it happens again? Even though he knows it's going to happen again.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem like people have gotten as bad as they were in this time period, right? Like what we're seeing in leading up to the flood is pretty dramatically terrible. And so this is sort of like the one thing that God's like, okay, here's what's going to happen, and then we're not going to do that again. We're not going to go back to that again. And so we haven't seen any escalation to that, regardless of how evil anyone wants to say the world is. It hasn't escalated to that point. It's pretty terrible at that point. Now it has been pretty terrible in pockets, and this is why you see stuff like Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But it hasn't exceeded this. That would be my best attempt to answer that. But at the end of the day, there are things like this where, to a certain degree, we have to just sort of say, I think this, but I'm not sure. There's also kind of like with what we were talking about with young Earth creationists yesterday, with how we interpret whether or not we can get the chronology from early Genesis and stuff like that. A lot of the people that would be old Earth creationists that would say that we shouldn't take Genesis 1 and 2 literally. A lot of those people would say that Genesis 1 to 11 is probably not historical, or at least not as explicitly historical as we would take it. And those people would probably say that there wasn't a global flood, that there was like a localized flood, and that God didn't literally kill everyone, but killed like a specific region with a flood. That's what those people. Now, for me, again, Genesis 1 to 11, to me, there's a lot of stuff there that it's like, I can kind of see where people would be coming from with that. I can kind of see where people would be coming from taking the more conservative approach of like, this is a global flood. I probably would lean more towards a global flood, if only for the reason that like, there are lots of other global flood stories that don't come from Israel. So it seems like embedded in human history, there's this narrative of a global flood. So I would be inclined to believe that there probably was one, but there are definitely people out there that would take this to be like a localized. So is that helpful? Yeah. Okay. It's interesting too, and this goes back to the point of God caring about creation, that the animals are saved. That God cares about His creation. Creation is a good thing, and He wants to take care of the animals just as much as He wants to take care of the people. We see this as well in probably one of my favorite, like, just funny places in the Bible is at the end of Jonah, when Jonah is all butthurt because God isn't doing what He wants him to do. God asks him, like, why shouldn't I be concerned for this entire city that has, I think he says 100,000 people in it or something like that, as well as many animals. And it's just like a weird, like, little add-on that he's like, there's all these people, and then all the animals. Like, why would I kill all the animals? So, yeah. So there's just places in Scripture like that. It's like, God cares. God, He cares about dogs. And, maybe cats. Maybe cats.
Wait.
I don't know.
He did make carbs.
Right, it's true. Yeah. So that's the covenant with Noah. Covenant with Abraham. This appears several times. There are several kind of additions to it. Initially, Abraham is Abram, and so in Genesis 12, 1-3, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred," and since we already have up, 284 hours to walk from to Jerusalem. 284 hours. And so this is the journey that Abram takes, right? In Genesis 12, he's told in leave your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. And he goes from here all the way over here. Abram roughly lives, again, assuming this is historical, and I think I feel much more confident in saying that Abram is a historical character than I would with Genesis 1-11. Assuming that he's a historical character, he lives probably 2000 BC. So this is like, there's no protection on the road. There's no police. There's, forget cell phones, forget phones, right? Imagine taking that, the way that I would explain, like, this kind of a journey is, imagine the zombie apocalypse, right? Like, you go on a journey, there is no one to protect you. Every step that you take is fraught with danger, right? And that's how far 284-hour journey that Abram takes, right? So this is kind of, not a small thing. A lot of times, when we look at stuff in the Old Testament and we see, he's in and he goes to Jerusalem, to us, that's like, oh, that's probably like a couple hours away, right? Like, no, that's like all the way across Iraq and into Israel. Like, this is not a small journey, right? And so in Genesis 12, Abram is given this promise that God will make his name great, that he will give him land, people, and there's sort of a hint at the idea of a Messiah. I think that these are the three things to me that I think, even if it's not explicit in the narrative for Abraham, these are the three things that we should think of when reading the Old Testament to kind of understand the development of the Old Testament. Is that the people of Israel are promised land, a people, a nation, and a ruler, a Messiah. And at any point in their history, you should interpret what they're doing based on how many of those three things they have, right? And so this starts with the promise to Abraham, which at this point is explicitly that he will give him a nation and descendants. And sort of implicitly, there's going to be a Messiah. Because at this point already, there's Genesis 3:15, right? This becomes the structure for the rest of the Old Testament. Everything in the Old Testament goes back to Abraham. He's the guy, right? So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are like the guys. They're the three patriarchs, right? Which, if you remember yesterday, when we were talking about the Old Testament, remember how many books are there in the Old Testament? 39. How many books are there in the New Testament? 27, yeah. How do we remember that?
Old, 3, Testament, 9.
Yeah, Old is 3, Testament's 9, so we have 3 and 9, and then 3 times 9 is 27. Yeah. So that's one of the things you missed yesterday. Really cheesy way to remember how many books there are in the Bible. So 39, 27 added together, we get 66, right? Well, one of the ways that you can remember more specifically in the Old Testament, anybody know how many major prophets there are? In the Old. There's only prophets in the Old. Yeah. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the major patriarchs, right? There are 3 major prophets that stand for the 3 major patriarchs. There's Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, right? So you have 3 major prophets, 3 major patriarchs. Anybody know how many minor prophets there are? Anybody know how many 12? How many? I just said 12. How many tribes of Israel there are? 12. Yeah. Yeah. And so minor prophets, there are 12 minor prophets from the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Now, Daniel, to some people, would be counted as a major prophet, but in the Hebrew Bible, doesn't get counted as a major prophet. It gets counted as one of the writings, and Lamentations also gets counted as one of the writings. And so 3 major prophets, 12 minor prophets. But this comes from Abraham, right? This is, the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The rest of Genesis is the story of Abraham. Genesis 12 through Genesis 50 is the story of Abraham and his descendants. And so he is the big deal. And even when you get into the New Testament, Abraham comes up a lot. So if you wanted to pick one person that the entire Bible was about and you didn't pick Jesus, your second choice should probably be Abraham, right? Because he's pretty high up there as far as important characters. The next character that there is a covenant with is Moses. This is where we get the 10 Commandments. And this is a painting of Moses about to smash the 10 Commandments, which is just one of my favorite places in the entire Bible, because he goes up to get the 10 Commandments, and Israel makes a golden calf and starts worshiping it. And when he's up with God, interceding that God would not destroy the Israelites, even though they're being rebellious, even though they're worshiping an idol, he's like, please don't destroy them, right? But then when he gets down to see what they're doing, he smashes the 10 Commandments, right? And in the text, in Hebrew, it says that he throws them down and then smashes them. And the way that it's said in Hebrew is there's the way that words or verbs specifically are reflected in Hebrew is you can indicate type of action. So you can indicate that you did something, or you can indicate that you did something vigorously, right? So you can say I broke it, or you can say I shattered it into a million pieces. I really, really broke it, right? And so it says that he threw them down, and then he vigorously broke them, right? So it's like he threw them down and took a rock and just went to work on them, right? And so just an amazing story. I love it. It's great. Another really funny part in the Bible that uses that same thing, since we're talking about it already, is in 1 Samuel. Saul does not kill one of the enemy kings that he's supposed to kill. And so Samuel, the prophet, comes up, draws somebody's sword, and then when it says that he hacked him to pieces, in 1 Samuel 15, the verb that gets used there is vigorous action. So he draws somebody's sword and then does not just chop his head off, but starts going to work on him with the sword. So
his head, his arms, his legs.
Yeah,
Let's get it all real quick.
yeah, he just goes all Edward Scissorhands on him, just just going nuts. Moses is a bit of a reluctant leader in Exodus. Exodus, we transition from Abraham being the major character to Moses being the major character. And, we call it Exodus, which is literally the way out of. In Hebrew, the book is called Shemot, which is names. There's probably a better name for the book of Exodus because the book of Exodus is all about names. Anybody know who the Pharaoh was in Exodus? It's a trick question because we don't know his name. And that's important, right? In the ancient world, we talked about honor and shame a little bit yesterday, about how your honor ranking comes from your father, from your family. Well, your name is a part of your honor. And so to not be named is very shameful. So the fact that Exodus, the entire book, gives us the name of Moses, but not the name of Pharaoh, right? Like they're intentionally shaming Pharaoh because we're going to forget his name. He does not get to be remembered. His name does not get to be remembered. He's not important, right? We're going to forget his name. We're going to remember Moses' name, right? This is one of the reasons why it's called names. Also, another important name that we get in Exodus is the name of Yahweh, the name of the Lord. Remember yesterday we said if you see in the Old Testament, Lord in all caps, in the Old Testament, it's Yahweh. It's the personal name of God. It's the name that God uses for himself when he shows up to Moses. This happens in Exodus 3 at the burning bush. And the way that he refers to himself in that conversation with Moses is Yahweh. He says, I will be what I will be, or I am what I am. And that's my name, basically. That's how you will refer to me. And the way that he says, I will be what I will be, or I am what I am, whichever way you translate that, is that word, I will be or I am, is related to the word Yahweh. So the way you would say I am is Ehya. The way that you would say he is Yahweh, right? Like there's a connection there. And so God says of himself, I am. God's people say of him, he is. Right? Does that make sense? And the word there in Hebrew, there's not a distinction between present tense and future tense because neither of them are complete. Right? What you're currently doing, you're not finished doing. And so there's not a distinction between what you're doing and what you will do because neither of them are over yet. Right? So I am and I will are the same. So when God refers to himself, he says, I am, I will be. And then when we refer to him, we say, he is, he will be. Right? Which that by itself is instructive to us with regard to the character of God. That his definition of himself is his providence. Right? His definition of himself is he will be. He will be what? Yeah. Like, yeah, he will be that. Well, what? All of it. Right? Whatever it is that you need, he will be that. Right? That's who he will be. Right? And that's how the narrative works in Exodus 3, is that Moses asks Yahweh for his name. And the reason he's asking him for his name is that in ancient religion, especially Egyptian religion, the name of the deity indicated what that deity had power over. So Moses is really asking God, what kind of power do you have? If you're a river god, I want to meet Pharaoh by a river. If you're a mountain god, I want to meet Pharaoh by a mountain. Because I want to leverage your power in our conversation. I don't want to meet with him where you're weak. So where are you powerful? And God's response to that is essentially, yes. Right? Not like, I'm powerful in these places, but yeah, I'm powerful. No. Where are you powerful? Yeah. No. Where? Yes. Right? Like, no. Like, I need to know where you can act. Right? Like, that's kind of how the conversation goes. And it seems like Moses gets a little bit frustrated with God, and you can kind of understand why. But, like, that's what God is trying to communicate. He's trying to communicate, like, no, I don't work the way that the Egyptians' gods work. I'm not limited to a place. I'm not limited to a thing. I'm not limited to an event. I'm not the God of the day or the God of the night. I'm not the God of the Nile or the God of the sea, right? I'm God, period, right? And so the fact that God calls himself he or I will be, and that we call him he will be, for us, I mean, that really should be like in any scenario that you encounter in your life, that's who God is, right? Like he will be. You need a provider, he will be. You need comfort, he will be, right? That is who God is. That's how he reveals himself to Moses in Exodus 3 and throughout the rest of Exodus. The Exodus itself is a template for how God saves. His concern is not just for the soul. His concern is rather for the total person. In Exodus 20, it says, I'm your God who delivered you out of Egypt, out of the house of oppressive slavery. He's not just concerned with getting them out of Egypt. He's concerned with getting them out of slavery. He didn't just get them out of slavery and leave them in Egypt. He didn't just get them out of Egypt and leave them in slavery, right? He got them out of Egypt and he got them out of slavery, right? He's concerned about the total person. He's not just concerned about where you are. He's concerned about how you are, right? He's concerned about the total person. So this is how God redeems. Through Moses, God makes a covenant with the people of Israel at Sinai. This is the Ten Commandments, right? And basically all of the rest of the law can be seen as an extrapolation of the Ten Commandments. Everything else that we see in Leviticus, everything that we see in Deuteronomy, all of the things and all of the rest of the law can be traced back to the Ten Commandments. It's all just an explanation of the Ten Commandments, right? That's the heart of all of it. So what we see there, right, leading up to the Ten Commandments, now therefore if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What God's doing here with Israel, and we see this through the rest of Scripture, is he is singling them out to be the people through whom he reaches the rest of the world, right? So he singles out Abraham, and then Abraham has descendants, and he singles out Abraham's descendants, right? And it's through those descendants that he's going to reach the rest of the world. That's the idea here in the covenant with Moses. Then years later, probably about 400 years later-ish, David is the king of Israel. There are 3 kings of Israel before Israel splits. There's Saul, David, and Solomon. Saul's not a good dude. David replaces him, and then Solomon is David's son. And then after Solomon, the kingdom splits, and we have Judah and we have Israel. And then there are kings of Judah and Israel, but there's not a king of a united kingdom anymore. So David, during David's reign, what did we say were the 3 things that we should think about with regard to the covenant with Abraham? What are the 3 things that God gave him, said he was going to give him? He's going to give him what? Land, people, and a king. Yeah, land, people, and Messiah, right? And so at the point that we have David, we have land, we have people, and we have a king, right? Now, Saul was king before David, but Saul was not a Messiah, really. He was anointed. Messiah means anointed. Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. So technically, he was sort of a Messiah, but he was a very bad Messiah. He wasn't very good at it. David was much better at it. And so at this point, we have land, nation, and Messiah, right? And so the people of Israel sort of have what was promised to Abraham for a window of time. For about 120 years, from Saul, David, Solomon, they have the land, they have the people, they have an anointed one, a king, right? About 120 years. And then that goes away. This, by the way, spoiler alert for moving forward, this period right here that we're talking about with David is the last time that there will be a land, nation, and Messiah in Israel until about 100 years before Jesus. So from 960 BC to 160 BC, there is no land, nation, Messiah. You're missing at least one of those 3 things. for those 800 years, right? And then in 160, when you get it, you only get it for 100 years, and then you lose it again. So that's one of the reasons why in the New Testament, when we were talking yesterday about like why do they hate the Romans so much, in the New Testament, do they have land, nation, and Messiah? They have the land, kinda. They have the nation, kinda. They have no Messiah, right? Because they're inhabiting the land and the people are there. So they have the land and the nation. They have no Messiah. Who's in the place of the Messiah? The Romans. So why do they hate the Romans? Because the Romans are doing what God should be doing. The Romans are doing what David should be doing, right? And so this is why when we get into the New Testament, this is a really big deal. They really want David again, right? They really want this king to come back. They really want this Messiah to come back that can get rid of Rome, because this is what they want, right? They want land, nation, Messiah. They want the Abrahamic promise, the Davidic promise, right? So at this point, Israel has fallen into idolatry. They're not very good, and this is why they have Saul, right? This is why they have the king before David, because they tell God, we want a king, and God basically is like, but I'm your king. And they're like, and they literally tell God, yeah, but we want to be like the other nations. And God's kind of like, the whole point of you is that you would not be like the other nations, right? Like that's the whole point. And they're like, yeah, but we want to be like the other nations. He's like, okay, well, I'm going to give you a king, and you're not going to like it. And they're like, no, we want a king. So he gives them Saul, and guess what? They don't like him. Right? And this, again, to me, is instructive for the character of God, because the kingship in Israel is a symbol of Israel rejecting God. Right? So, like, just imagine whatever it is that you've done that's been a rejection of God. We all have those things, right? We all have the thing, like we were talking about yesterday, where it's like, just don't do this thing, and we're like, okay, don't do that thing. And then we turn around and we go do that thing, right? Like we all have that. That's the king in Israel. God's like, you don't want a king. And they're like, right, we don't want a king. You should give us a king though, right? Then God saves them through the king, right? God doesn't give them Saul and say, see, I told you it was a bad idea, you shouldn't have a king. God gives them Saul, and he's like, see, I told you it was a bad idea, but you know what? I'm gracious, so I'm going to give you a good king now. And you know what? The Messiah is going to come through the line of the king. So I'm going to save you through the means of your rebellion.
That's too nice.
Right? I mean, that's God, though. Right? Like, that's the gospel, that God would be that generous to us, that he would use the thing that we have used to rebel against him, that he would use that thing to save us. That he would use that thing to reach us. Right? Like, that's absurd. I would never think that that's even possible. But that's what God does. Right? He uses the things, and he uses what the enemy intends for evil for good. Right? He turns things that the enemy wants to use to destroy people, he turns those things around to destroy the enemy. Paul says in Corinthians that we comfort with the comfort that we've received. So whatever your story is, God uses your story to reach people with that story. Right? I'm a Bible college professor, but I am also an ex-pothead. Right? Like, I spent years and years and years and years and years doing nothing but smoking weed all day and watching Friday. Right? Like, that was my life for years. And, I mean, I get drunk all the time too, but I really just wanted to smoke weed. And I've done some just horrible things. Right? And yet, God has redeemed my life, has redeemed my story. And I can now talk to people who have gone through what I went through and say, like, hey, I'm on the other side of that. I have been there, and I know that God can bring you through that. Right? I grew up without my father. My dad died a week before I turned 1. And so it was just me, my mom, and my 2 siblings. That was it. And so I can tell people who do not have a father, I know what that's like. And I'm on the other side of it. And God can redeem that. I have 2 kids now. I'm a father. You know how weird it is to not have a father and be a father? That is super bizarre. That is super bizarre, right? Like, my dad died a week before I turned 1. And so the last week before my son's first birthday, it dawned on me, I'm about to know my son longer than my dad knew me. Like, that's weird. That's a really weird thing. And I still have these like anniversaries in my life where I'm like, well, now I'm older than my dad ever was. Like, so there's that, you know. Like just there's these things that happen, and so like I can look at people who are in those kinds of situations. I have students that are in those kinds of situations. That I mean, I had a student just a few years ago whose dad abandoned him and his entire family. And I can tell him, like, I know what it's like to not have a dad. And it really sucks. And I'm not trying to minimize it at all. But I can tell you, as someone who has gone through that God is good. Right? That God will take the rejection of demanding a king and will turn it into something beautiful. The Messiah. Right? He will take the stupidest thing in your life, the stupidest thing done to you, or the stupidest thing done by you, or both, and turn it into something beautiful. Because that's what he does, right? That's the whole story of Scripture from beginning to end. That's what God does, right? Does that make sense? You guys tracking with me here? Yeah. So, as a result, God listens to the people's cry for a king after the false start with Saul, who's just a total idiot. Saul, by the way, in Hebrew, this is really funny, literally means the one you asked for. So God gives them the one you asked for. Like, so it's just hilarious to me that, like, his name is like, you got what you asked for, here's what you asked for. Like,
So glad he has a sense of humor.
yeah, God definitely has a sense of humor. I really enjoy it.
I
So,
know. He likes to be like, oh, you said not to do that. Okay.
yeah,
Here, let me make you do that real quick.
yeah. Fun times.
Sure.
So after Saul, David rules Israel for 40 years. Saul gets 40 years, David gets 40 years, Solomon gets 40 years, so you have 120 years of land, nation, and Messiah. Though Saul, like I said, is like Messiah with an asterisk, right? Like he's technically an anointed one, but he's kind of an idiot. So David rules for 40 years, Solomon rules for 40 years. Solomon's pretty good too, for the most part, apart from some stupid things. David's pretty good, except for some really stupid things. They're not as bad as Saul, but they're mostly good, I'd say. To him was given a covenant that a descendant of David would establish a kingdom of everlasting peace, thereby blessing all families of the earth and fulfilling the promises made to Abraham. So, as we go through these covenants, we sort of pick up it's like yes and, right? Like there's the covenant to Noah, like yes, I'm going to do that, and Abraham. And then you get to the covenant of Moses, and the covenant of Moses is like, yeah, Noah and Abraham, yes, and this other thing, right? And the same thing with David, right? It's just like building on top of, and all of those covenants, though it was hard to see at the time, now looking back on it, it's easier to see. All of those covenants are pointing directly to Jesus, right? All of those covenants are pointing directly to Jesus as the fulfillment. So for the rest of the story, to kind of like summarize the rest of the Old Testament, we'll go through a little bit more of this in a little bit more detail, but there's a single coherent narrative from Genesis 12 to the end of Nehemiah that tells the story of God's dealing with his covenant people, the Israelites. First and Second Chronicles is a retelling of the whole Israelite story that gets retold a bit later. God's covenant faithfulness is consistent and insistent from pre-exile to post-exile all the way through. The wisdom books, Job, Psalms, for the most part, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, are written through this time period and reflect important perspectives on experiencing lives of suffering, joy, wisdom, and of love. Song of Solomon is like, well, it's interesting. If you've never read Song of Solomon, it's The entire book is about sex. The whole book. The entire book, it's all cover to cover, it's about sex. So it's two people who are married talking to each other about having sex with one another. Now, I think that there are other things to be taken from that, that there is, the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church, and that Song of Solomon can be read in some sense as an allegory between Jesus and the church. But at its heart, it's about married couple that are having sex, right? Remember yesterday we talked about Genesis 3 and Revelation, and how Genesis 3 to the original audience, probably not talking about Satan, but in Revelation it is. Kind of the same thing with Song of Solomon. The original audience, Song of Solomon's just talking about married couple having sex. But later on, okay, I kind of see how we could read this as, Christ and the church in some ways. So, eventually the Israelites proved so faithless to the covenant, and repeatedly broke the promises they made to God, that God sent outside armies to destroy the people, tear down the temple, remove them from the land. Exile, but also always possibility of restoration. The prophetic books, Isaiah through Malachi, tell the poetic story of God's repeated attempts to turn the people away from their idolatry and injustice, the threat of exile and the consequences of their failure, to repent and be faithful to the covenant. So this is sort of like a brief snapshot of the Old Testament. We doing okay on that? Is that like...
Yeah, I'm just afraid it's going to die.
The battery's going to die? Yeah. We can pause here for a break. We can take 5 and then